Yeah.
Now, is it safe to say that one of the ways of defining post-traumatic stress is that the person isn't remembering what happened, the person is actually reliving what happened?
That is a key element. There are actually 3 clusters of classic post-traumatic stress symptoms. One of them is what they call arousal, which means just intense fear or rage, just intense activation of this alarm system. The second cluster has to do with avoidance and numbness, that parasympathetic thing, where you're just kind of out of it, isolated, disconnected, and avoiding things. And the third cluster, which is the nastiest, the peskiest, the most persistent, is the one you talk about. It's called re-experiencing. It's flashbacks, it's nightmares, repetitive nightmares that are the same, and intrusive thoughts. And what's interesting or unique about those things are they don't change over time. A normal memory changes over time. It fades, it distorts. But a post-traumatic, you can't even call it a memory, a flashback, it's like a moment in time that is absolutely the same and comes back, if anything, with greater intensity each time.
Oh. And
it's close to a hallucination on a person who is not psychotic. So and people think they're crazy because it's like, what is this? It's been a year. I'm still having these things. If anything, they're worse than they were before. I must be crazy. That's what people think. They're not.
And I can see why.
Yeah.
Oh, it sounds so overwhelming. And it is for the person suffering. It's so
terrible.
overwhelming.
It's terribly confusing.
Right. And one of the things that your book points out is that this very often leads people to self-medicating.
Yes.
And if we could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, it's one of the many ways that people respond to post-traumatic stress, but there's a huge number of people who will take to using alcohol or drugs or there are other ways to self-medicate, which I'll talk about, but alcohol and drugs are certainly, very high on the list. People can self-medicate by being obsessively busy. You run on adrenaline all day long, overscheduling yourself so you can't think, and you're in this constant alarm state. And that's, in a way, a kind of behavioral self-medication.
But I think that very often people look at the symptoms
Yes.
and say, or they'll look at, well, he's acting that way because he's been drinking.
Right.
He's acting that way because he's driven by whatever, ambition. But underneath all of this, there's something else totally that's going on.
Very often, yes. And it's true. I mean, it is a chicken-egg thing. A lot of recovery people say, and rightly so, we can't treat you until you stop self-medicating. And that's totally legitimate. But a lot of people also say it's the real issue, as you just said, is not the drinking. It's the trauma, the depression, the distress. It's very intense. It's not like anything else. I have to say, of all the treatment I've done over the years, the most anguishing, the most painful, the most heartrending is post-traumatic stress.
And sometimes the trauma can change people's lives. For instance, I've done a lot of study of rape cases, and I did some rape counseling here on the island. And some people are able to deal with that and can move on, and some people are never the same again. And so let's talk about rape for a moment, because that is very painful and hard to talk about even. But that's where a lot of what you're talking about comes to the fore. When you read rape histories and when you talk to rape, the first thing that comes across is that most of those women thought they were going to die.
Yes, they were in terror of their life.
Exactly. And that it had nothing to do with sex, it all had to do with power. And these are things that get repeated over and over, case by case. there's so much going on that has nothing to do with the act itself. And the repercussions, therefore, go on and on and ripple.
There's an interesting statistic that shows that of people who are raped, a huge number go on to get post-traumatic stress, because it's not just being in fear of your life, although Lord knows that would be enough, but it's also being demeaned, being humiliated, being really degraded in certain ways, which adds to the damage.
Right.
And someone who's been raped is more likely to have post-traumatic stress than someone who's been in an earthquake and lost all their limbs.
Oh my.
Because it's like that element of human violence, human against human violence, that is more damaging almost to the spirit than a natural disaster that does more to your body.
That now this person knows that she's living in a world where this sort of thing can happen.
This can happen. And yes, and you lose your innocence, you lose your sense of our fantasy of being in control. We aren't anyway, but we like to think we are.
Yes, and for some, it's very important to hold on to that we're in control thing, right?
But I also have to say that even though there are all these gradations, even though there are all these different ways you can get post-traumatic stress, one of the things that really is important to remember is, nonetheless, post-traumatic stress is post-traumatic stress, and the symptoms pretty much look the same, whether it's a car crash, or a hurricane, or a rape, or a terrible childbirth situation. That it looks the same because it's a biochemical event, and the same stuff gets tripped off with some minor variations.